ain't what it is. Give it back or take the risk. I paint for hope and nothing else. Who and I know my worth, as you can surely tell. And we all care about the things we cannot change. Is there any relief out there? So much chaos in and about me. We all care about the things we cannot see. Is there really a God somewhere, a breathing like me? 'Cause all I know ain't what it is. Oh, but I'll take the risk. And hope I live. I'll tarry home. When the job is done. I tell you
on increasing racial and gender equity in higher education and employment settings, and she believes in creating social justice cultures and movements that foster healing, interdependence, dignity, and freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could give me a round of applause for Paula Ioanide. You can pick her shoes. Up next, I'd like to introduce Rashawn Ray. He's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Maryland in College Park. He received a PhD in sociology from Indiana University in 2010. From 2010 to 2012, he was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Research Scholar at the University of California. His research addresses the mechanisms that manufacture and maintain racial and social inequality, and his work also speaks to ways that inequality may be attenuated through racial uplift activism and social policy. Along with other scholars in the humanities, he is currently exploring the evolution of the Black Lives Matter movement as a social and collective identity. He has received mentorship awards from the Department of Sociology, Ronald E. McNair Post-Baccalaureate Achievement Program, and the Philip Merrill Presidential Scholar Program at the University of Maryland. In 2014, he was selected as 40 under 40 Prince George's County, and in 2010, he was recognized as the outstanding Black male leader of tomorrow for the city of Bloomingdale, Indiana. Yes. Currently, Ray is a member of the, I had to think about IN, I'm so sorry, I don't know all my state abbreviations yet. Currently, Ray is a member of the National Committee on Nominations for the American Sociological Association and the co-chair of the Ford Foundation Scholars Conference. Please give it up for Rashawn Ray. Okay, up next we have Eduardo Bonilla-Silva. See? Yes? Okay, gracias. He is a professor of sociology at Duke University, trained in class analysis, political sociology, and sociology of development and globalization. In the last 20 years, most of his work has been in the area of race, and he has published on racial theory, race and methodology, colorblind racism, the idea that race stratification in the United States is becoming Latin America-like, racial grammar, HWCUs, race and human rights, race and citizenship, whiteness, and the Obama phenomenon, among many other things. In all of his work, he has contended that racism is fundamentally about racial domination, hence racism is a collective and structural phenomenon in society. He has his PhD from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, his MA from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and his BA from the University of Puerto Rico. Please give it up for Eduardo Bonilla-Silva. Sugar pocket. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce Dr. David Ikard, a professor that we have here, most beloved. He's the director of Africana Studies Department, and he is also responsible for bringing to you this year's and last year's No Justice, No Peace program. So please give it up for your beloved facilitator, Dr. Ikard.
Gabby a hand for those introductions. Welcome. Welcome.
Thank you.
If everybody is awake, it's still early. First and foremost, I'd like to encourage everybody to tweet under the hashtag No Justice, KNOW Justice. It's always good to make the things that are local, national, and international, particularly when we have such important events going on like this. So make sure that you tweet this out, as I'm sure our conversation will take some exciting turns, and of course will depend largely upon the audience and the kinds of things that you will want to ask this esteemed panel. First, some love to the sponsors that have made this day's event possible. Sociology, I'd like to thank Sociology, the student group BAM, Multicultural Center, and particularly Renee Callan, who is always, give Renee a hand. The unsung hero who makes things happen behind the curtain, so to speak. And, I rely on her a great deal on a number of levels. The English department, the Modern Foreign Language, and the College of Arts and Sciences all have been co-sponsors of this event, and I am appreciative of that co-sponsorship. And of course, this is an Africana event, and this is our second annual series, No Justice, No Peace, that was initiated primarily out of student protests. We had protests last year, and I surveyed the students and asked them what types of programs would they like to see happen, and this is what came out of that program was this series. So this series is fundamentally about you, and it's fundamentally about the kind of, hopefully to foster the kind of climate of intellectual and political engagement that will hopefully not only just inform you as students, but also as citizens and as activists. Right? Let me give you a kind of a quick introduction in terms of the format and how it's going to go today. I'm going to facilitate the discussion and participate where necessary, because you know, as my students know, I can't shut up. You know, I got fire shut up in my bones, as James Baldwin would say. I have a series of questions that I want to ask the panelists to kind of get the conversation started. And we'll do that probably for about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, but I want to reserve the majority of time for students to come to the mic and ask our panelists questions. They are here for you. This is your opportunity to engage them. And again, before we launch off into our discussion, I want to put one more plug in for, we have one more event scheduled for this series. It's a 3-part series. Yesterday, we had the pleasure of 2 lectures by Paula and Rashawn, and tomorrow, Eduardo Bonilla-Silva will give a lecture on the racial politics of being at a historically white university. That's going to be at the Witten Learning Center tomorrow at 3:30. I believe that room is 140. 30 or 40? 140. 140. See, my students, they saving me, right? 140. You know, so tomorrow, 3:30, Witten Center, 140. If you have not heard this brother speak, you will be in for a treat. Give a sense of that tonight, but I am looking forward to that talk tomorrow. So, without further ado, let me jump in and kind of open up with a question for the panelists about social justice, right? Because the title of our series is No Justice, peace, right? And I want each of them to kind of talk to or speak to what social justice at this particular moment looks like, and how do we, and I'm thinking here particularly about people of color and those people who are allies, how do we engage in this, very conflicted, contentious racial climate where somebody like a Donald Trump is at the top of the Republican ticket saying that, foreigners or Chicanos are rapists, criminals, and that blacks commit the most crimes, when he is sexist, when he is homophobic, when he is xenophobic, and I think watching the New Hampshire results come in, I think they said something like 60% of the GOP vote were supported the idea of not only not letting Muslims come into this country, but actually making all Muslims leave the country. So how do we, in this type of climate, how do we think about social justice? How can we develop activism around social justice? How can we, on a personal level, negotiate social justice and the tensions that come with trying to speak to that, as we have seen with the ways in which Cam Newton has been politicized, the way in which Beyonce has recently been politicized. How can we think about social justice and what that looks like in this really critical historical moment? Make sure turn the mic on. Make sure that's on. Yeah. So who wants to get the party started?
Okay, this is age discrimination. Let me begin by making a comment about Bernie Sanders. I mentioned today that in the class that I'm feeling the burn, but I'm definitely not feeling hilarious. I want to make a comment that there are elements of the Bernie campaign that I'm interested in exploring and pushing forward. And if people sort of, really push me hard, and we ultimately end up in some kind of critical support of this campaign. But I do want us to think about, and mention this today in the discussion with the students, that what we need to think is to take this notion of the political revolution outside the political party system, because the political party system is corrupted. And that is right. So you cannot claim it's corrupted and then please give me money to participate more in the political party system. But let me then sort of problematize his approach to social justice. And it's an approach that those of us who have been inclined to the Marxist tradition to support it, we know the approach quite well, which is the approach that says have a class-based agenda and all other forms of domination will be at risk. And I'm here to tell you that that is nonsense. So although obviously for us, class matters, so does race and gender. And we should never believe that a class approach to race inequality will get us to the promised land. So what we need to begin thinking of doing is developing this intersectional approach to politics. And I don't know how to do it, but what I know is that as a person of color, I'm not going to put concern about class, gender, sexual orientation, etc., etc., etc. But I'm unwilling to get in the platform of the Bernie Sanders of the world. And those of us in the sociological tradition know that we in sociology have that tradition long-standing. Yes, so we have one of the most important sociologists of the 20th century and now 21st, William Peters Wilson, happens to be African American, made that argument in the 1970s, yeah, that taking a class approach would take us to the promised land, and now 34 years later we know that that is not the case. So this is the moment that we're living, that the most progressive tradition within electoral politics is telling us to take the class approach, which is better than what we had before, which was no class analysis. Yeah? So in that, let's give kudos to Bernie for bringing class back to the discussion. But now our job is to push further, to realize that if we want social justice, the social justice will not emanate out of electoral politics. I'm not telling you not to vote, not participate, not to engage. I'm telling you to be historical and accurate in your participation and realize that the historical record clearly shows if you want deep progress on race or class or gender, put most of your eggs on the basket of social movement politics rather than electoral politics. Electoral politics, given the way that the political system is structured, will give you, at best, small reforms that are ultimately meaningless. So my call today is for us to think about how to advance the social movement tradition, and then we can have a debate about, given that we have this election, what are we going to do? That is an interesting debate, but the more focus on money and resources and time we put in the electoral tradition, the less we put on the fundamental, which is Black Lives Matter movement, your student movement, yeah, demanding the change of these historically white colleges and universities, yeah. So we need to then sort of change our recent tradition, yeah, the last 30 years, since the 1980s. I'm old enough to remember when we made the pact with the devil. It was 1980, the election of Ronald Reagan. So Trump today is the equivalent of Ronald Reagan. I remember when we demonized Reagan. I don't say he was a medeteta yet. So, you don't know what medeteta means? I'm in Miami, half of you know what that is. So what we need to then realize is that we need to then push into this, push against the electoral tradition, that we cannot continue with this idea of choosing between the lesser of two evils. Because if we keep doing that, we ultimately endorse evil. And if you check the data for the last 20 years, a lot of the stuff we're having today, mass incarceration, etc., it was not delivered to us by Republicans. It was Bill Clinton. So always remember that the Clintons have blood, literally blood, in their hands.
So first of all, thank you for having us and for this amazing opportunity to be with, rich minds and incredible scholars of excellence. I want to talk, I come from a scholarly background, but also an organizing background, mostly around prison abolition and around, how to make that actually on a scale where people can kind of handle it, right? Because we say that as a long-term vision, but on the day-to-day ground, it looks, like something much different, right? So one of the things that I want to distinguish between is a kind of reactionary politics versus a visionary and a transformative politics, right? In my view, most of what we spend our energy on, our collective energy on, is a kind of, beating against, you could call it the white devil, you could call it, this kind of, the xenophobia and the racism that Donald Trump's across the United States embody, or the state, right? And kind of seeking a recognition for the illegitimate suffering that, racism is creating in people of color's lives and poor people's lives, that is seeking a recognition for that grievance that is not forthcoming, right? So I'm saying, of course we have to challenge the illegitimacy of the police killings, the brutality, the mass incarceration, the lives that are lost, right, in our name and with our taxpayer dollars. We have to interrupt that logic. But if we only keep pulling at that state or at that entity that will not be forthcoming with any type of recognition of that suffering and of that, of that grievance, then we will get very deflated very fast, right? So for me, it's always a two-pronged approach as an organizer. You expect the state to always say no and to always not recognize the blood, that the death economies that are being reproduced in our name, right? Because to do so, for example, for the police to admit what they are doing systematically in these police killings would mean to give up exactly who they are, right, and what they were set up to do, institutionally speaking. If we don't also channel our direction, our energies, our emotional energies, our tangible energy towards a visionary politics, not just what we want to tear down, but also what we want to build. And Grace Lee Boggs is a phenomenal person to read on this and to kind of get inspired by, right? Because she said if we don't know what we want to build, then we don't ever get to practice interpersonally the type of intimate politics that we want to live. So it all stands at this kind of impasse level, right? And we get exhausted and then we essentially get depleted and we don't actually get replenished in seeing something that we want to transform with like-minded people who want to come on board. One thing I want to say about, my work is on the connections between race and emotion, right? And one thing that I see the Republicans and the right being extremely good at is the cultivation and the use and the organization of public feelings, mostly organized around racial fear or racial antagonism or resentment or jealousy or fetishism, mostly organizing a block of people around that and then getting them to do and agree with an entire political platform that might actually be against their own interests, right? But they go with it because they've cultivated a public feeling that appeals to people. And I think the left has failed in providing a counter public feeling. In other words, how might we create an emotional glue that binds us to one another, but one that is aligned with racial and gender justice, right? It is actually possible to be cultivated, but the problem is that we're always reacting to the state, to the conservatives, to whatever. We never actually get time to build this alternative emotional economy that gets us to also channel our energy towards one another, the people who are walking with us, right? So for me, the visionary politics, and on the ground this might look like I'm going to interrupt the state when it wants to build a jail, right? I'm going to do everything to show up at the meetings and tell it you will not build a jail, and I'll block it even with my own body. But at the same time, I'm going to expect them to keep saying no, right? So I'm not going to expect them necessarily to win on that level, but at the same time, I'm going to say, okay, what might justice look like if we didn't depend on incarceration amongst us? What forms of accountability can we have for various forms of interpersonal violence, right? Because if we don't build that alternative vision, then we're still kind of stuck in reproducing the very thing that we're critiquing. In other words, we still depend on the state to give us the justice that we just critiqued it for not being able to deliver, right? So that's kind of what I want to focus on, is how do we build a counter movement, not based so much on, on a kind of public feeling, right? On the level of that's something that gets people moving out of their chairs, not just kind of keeps responding like, no, you're wrong. No, you have bad information, because that doesn't actually speak to people.
So when I think about what social justice looks like currently, I think about something that I highlighted yesterday, which is that Black Lives Matter is simply new in name, right? I mean, these incidents have been going on for a while. What actually makes this different, though, is the usage of technology, right? It's the power of social media. It's the power of the phones that you have in your hands, right? And that's what I'm doing. I'm taking notes. Taking notes like you all, these brilliant people up here, David. You're doing amazing things. And so when I think about it only being new in name, the social media is new. So what it allows you to do is you can broadcast your activism. You can broadcast your marginalization. You can broadcast your unjust treatment. And then you can make your voice and your bodies heard and seen in a way that we haven't necessarily seen before in America. And I think that's what makes this movement different, is the ability for you all to instantaneously take a picture or shoot a video or put your words on your phone, and someone across the world and across the country can now access it instantly and can say, there's something happening in Miami that we need to pay attention to. There's something happening in Cleveland we need to pay attention to. There's something happening at Yale we need to pay attention to. There's something happening in Missouri we need to pay attention to. And the list will go on and on. And so when you broadcast your activism, your marginalization, your pain, your unjust treatment, it actually leads to a response. I think one of the things people didn't realize is just how strategic leaders of the civil rights movement actually were, in the fact that they actually worked strategically to try to make sure that what they were doing did not fall on deaf ears. So they actually strategically tried to make sure that what they were doing would end up on the news, on the front page, because that's how they got the president's attention, right? That was how they got the mayor's attention, the governor's attention, is what was actually on the news or on the front page of papers. You all don't have to do that. You can use social media and circumvent traditional gatekeepers in a way that we haven't seen before, right? So your activism can become your fingers. Now, obviously, boots on the ground becomes very important. As I talked about yesterday, we actually see that social media activism translates into actual boots on the ground, right? The most popular days on Twitter over the past year and a half have consisted of the most of the times in which we saw the most activism happening on the ground, right? So that becomes key. How do we engage with this racial climate with Donald Trump on top of the post? Well, I'll tell it to you like this. What we're seeing is that even if he doesn't win, we are seeing the pendulum for what is allowed in public discourse to be shifted so far right. And this is the thing, as a country, we're not very liberal. I know we say we have liberals, but we're not very liberal. I mean, when you compare the United States, kind of our political attitudes, our racial attitudes, social attitudes, to individuals in other countries, we're just as a country, we are pretty center and possibly right to center. Even people who think that they're pretty liberal actually aren't if you live in other places, right? So what we're saying is that he's shifting the pendulum so far right that even if he doesn't win, what is allowed and what people are allowed to say and do is so extreme that it's problematic. So analyzing Twitter data, what we've seen, we started actually when Trump started trending, we were like, wow, this dude is really getting traction. It's serious now, right? You know, at first, when we first started running, people laughed. People were like, it's the apprentice dude. And then it got real serious, right? And so we've been collecting data on Trump over the past several months. So we have seen a rise in white supremacist, not only dialogue and discussion, but white supremacist organizations networking with each other, communicating with each other, and now taking that conversation offline. That's when you know it gets serious. That's when we know things get serious with Twitter. Is when people are going back and forth, people have found some type of hashtag they can use. They found certain users that they talk about, and then they kind of stop talking. Right? It's kind of like they hit people on the DM, and all of a sudden they're doing something completely different that we're not necessarily seeing. Finally, how do we negotiate social justice and activism in light of Cam Newton and Beyonce? I'll say this. Understand that when you overtly and vehemently express your dignity and blackness, the majority group will criticize and reject you always, right? So looking for acceptance from the majority group is not what you should do, right? So we do not always have to evaluate our dignity in comparison to whiteness. And when I hear the narratives about Beyonce and Cam Newton, if you actually listen to them, whether it be Cam Newton when he was standing in his locker room, he was like, I'm not trying to be like these other people. You asked Beyonce, she said, I did that. She was basically saying, I did that for people who I care about and who look like me. She wasn't doing that for other people, right? The thing is, though, they think, oh, you're on the biggest, one of the biggest stages in the world. You have the ball in your hand and you're on, maybe Cam Newton, or you were on the stage during halftime. You were supposed to accommodate, right? So that sense of white entitlement led them to think they were going to accommodate. That's why they were so mad. They were like, we could have chose from several of you all. We chose you when you get up here and make us look like fools and clowns, right? But the thing is, from Cam Newton and Beyonce's perspective, they're like, we weren't doing that for you, right? We were doing that for people who look like us. And I think that's the thing, is that when we get in these spaces, particularly in higher education, we oftentimes start doing things on other people's terms instead of our own terms, right? And in order to do that, we have to go through a process of actually unlearning some stuff that we've learned about how systems operate. And when we do that, we can go back to a point to say, how do I do this on my own terms? Social media is an example of that, right? Where I think if you're our age or older, some of my grad students, they were like, this is a big deal, Rashawn, we need to pay attention to this. I was like, man, this stuff is a fad. People are gonna stop texting and uploading stuff like that. I was wrong, right? And they were like, let's just collect the data. And now all of a sudden we have all these data that started with you all. And so keep pushing that, right? Don't let us talk you out of that, right? What you all are doing is great, but you have to realize, don't look for other people's approval in the process of doing it.
Can I just say one really quick thing about Beyonce's Super Bowl performance and Rudy Giuliani's response to it, which I don't know if you heard. He immediately interpreted her dance as being anti-police. Now, what's so remarkable about the white response right, or the establishment's police response, thinking that the message was directed to them as opposed to other people of color, is that they understand very well the potential contagiousness of Beyonce's power to create a feeling of togetherness, of collectivity, of empowerment, of resilience, of perseverance, and that you just put it out there in the middle of the most watched television show, and then that level of emboldening is such a threat to white supremacy and to the white imagination about how things should work, right? That they will take it as a threat precisely because they understand its potential to spread, right? And always what white supremacy has done in the past is adjust, right? Always adjust. First comes violence, then comes negotiation, and then comes repackaging, right? So that in order to, how do you quell that power? And when you start looking at the Black radical tradition or any people of color's tradition of resilience and resistance from that perspective, that in fact white supremacy always has to respond to it, right, rather than the other way around. Because the reason white supremacy keeps having to adjust is because people have resisted and tried to break it down, right? So for me, symbolically, she did that for whatever her motivations were, but everybody's on pin needles because of that contagious power. And that's precisely what I think we need to be doing more of. But again, it takes fearlessness. Which is flawless, right?
You all raised incredibly interesting questions about social justice, and it made me think about a student discussion that happened here a couple of years ago, right after Trayvon Martin had been killed. And the students were trying to get together and ferret out, discuss out, like how they could respond to this phenomenon. And one of the things that young people will continue to say, as I did when I was 19 or 20, is that, and you heard it was a dominant thing. And the student said, well, what we need is for people to be educated, right? We need people to be educated, right? Now, we're in a scholarly environment and we're all scholars, and what we deal with is data. We deal with, right, facts. We deal with history. We deal with, right? We deal with numbers. We deal with things that are provable, that have to be defended. So can you speak to how it is that this idea that we need to educate, that education will move us beyond this kind of impasse of like social injustice? Like, how do we begin? What kind of message would you give to the students about thinking about that idea that somehow we can educate our way or we can intellectualize our way through this process? I want to get your thoughts on that mindset. And connected to that, students also talked about their own behavior, right? It seems like whenever we get into these kinds of discussions, people are talking about self-determination, personal agency, right? Well, if Black people wouldn't act a certain way, behave a certain way, speak a certain way, that these are the things that elicit the kind of responses from the police. These are the things that elicit the kind of response from society. How would you approach that kind of that idea, even to the point of respectability politics, right? If I wear a suit, if I speak a certain kind of way, if I don't, right, wear my hair a certain kind of way, then that actually has some kind of impact on how whites see me and how not only do they treat me, but they treat other people that look like me. I'd like to get your thoughts on how to help our students navigate those kind of discourses of thinking about behavior, and again, how they think about addressing social justice or injustice.
So we sociologists have been central in spreading the notion that education is the cure to the so-called disease of racism. And we have made This is not a good contribution on our part. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were the most educated members of the white group during slavery, and I don't think that helped them a lot. Yeah? Not because of that they decided, well, we're not going to own slaves because that is immoral. Yeah? But we have to go back to why is it that the notion of education is secure to racism? Why does that formula work? It works because we assume that the problem of racism is intolerance. That the problem of racism is people not knowing. That if they know better,
But do better.
they do better. And of course, if we change the analysis and assume that and claim that the problem of racism is fundamentally about the system of racial domination, then domination is beyond good and evil. Yeah? After it is in place, then all actors in the society sort of follow the script. And some of them may be good people, yeah? Within the boundaries of how we define goodness within slavery or Jim Crow today. And I wanted to bring this point just to provoke the audience that although we need to be careful with clowns like Trump and the Klan and be monitoring big time the increase in traditionally white supremacist organizations, I think we have to be also clear that the main enemy today is not Trump and the Klan. Okay? The main enemy today is sort of the new face of racism, the colorblind, and it is, and I ask the people of color in the audience, for every time you have been called the N-word, you probably can tell me the number of other incidents in which in the racial transaction, anger, hate was not part of it yet. So there are new ways, this post-civil rights, this so-called post-racial way of maintaining domination, which can involve giving you an exam that doesn't measure Jack to exclude you from a university like Miami, or you go into the store and rather than telling you, hey, I don't want you here, they just tell you, may I help you? It's okay. Yeah, hey, are you sure that you belong? This dress is really expensive. And then the second part of your question was on this idea that if we just behave, right? And it's not a new thing in our community. Yes, so if you go and read the narrative of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, particularly the black elite, always was concerned with behavior, yeah? And trying to discipline the poorer members of the community, because the concern was if they were not like they are, then white people would treat us right, right? And that old argument has now been magnified. So now everybody's in the game that if we just accommodate, if I dress right, if I pull my pants, if I speak like white folks, if I change my hair, if I do this, and they're missing the fundamental. If you still black, yeah. So Malcolm X had a joke, and I'm not going to repeat the concept he used, but he basically said, how do you call a black man with a PhD? And he said,
Nigga.
yes. Okay, so it is true. So Rashawn and I can tell you that presumably we are successful members of our community, and we can tell you this story after story in the academy and outside, where our education, our class background, and sometimes we signify class supposedly to get protected, except that it doesn't. Because if I drive a Getomobile, I'm stopped. And if I drive the Lexus, I'm stopped. Yeah? If I dress down, I'm stopped. If I dress up, I'm like, oh, pretty black man, what is it? Is he still that cold? So that game, that sort of accommodation, and I'm thinking now in an audience of college students who most likely will be professionals, and you will be going through a process of, whitening, yeah? So, talk differently, dress differently, learn how to play golf, tennis, all kinds of white shit. And at some point, after 50 years of social integration and 50 years of the civil rights community and the laws, when are we going to begin behaving as free people? When are we going to do our thing? rather than trying to accommodate. At some point, we have to be free. And no social movement is successful. No people liberate themselves. At some point, we say, no more. And it's funny that 50 years after the civil rights movement, we still have not reached the point where we say, no more. I am not going to change my hair so that you're like, oh, I don't like your hair, I don't like yours either. Okay? When are we going to be like, an eye for an eye? I'm an Old Testament person, okay? And we keep with this accommodation, and I want you to be strategic, but not stupid. Yeah? Strategic behavior is one thing, but accommodating to everything, thinking that by doing that, you are going to get to the promised land, good luck with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll start with a response from Black people acting so this respectability politics. And I must be in a storytelling mood. I most likely about. I really don't tell stories, but I'm encouraged to tell them.
Wow.
So as I told the class earlier today, I think people forget MLK was assassinated in a suit. I went to college in Memphis. We would have a march every year. It would start at a slave auction block right off the shore from the Mississippi River. And then we would walk from the slave auction block to the Lorraine Motel, where we would have a big rally, a big party, these sorts of things. And you would really leave empowered. And then on my way back to campus, I would ride down Union Street. I think it was Union or Poplar, one of the two. And I would look to my left, and there would be a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Do you all know who he is? And I'm only bringing this up to make this point about that it's not necessarily about all these groups. So he was one of the founders of the KKK. What does that mean in a city to do a march like that, and then the statue of this man is still standing there at the courthouse? What does that say about what we're doing? Is it for fluff? Because without any demands, what are we marching for? Just to say we marching to say that we are acknowledging this person's birthday, right? I'll tell another story. Well, first off, President Obama, he's interesting, right? Because when he was on the campaign trail and he was signaling to black people that he was down, and they would say, well, you identify as black, right? He would always say, well, last time I tried to catch a cab in New York City, right? That was what he was saying. His point was that, yes, of course, because I didn't treat it like anybody else when I'm in public space. When I remember my first day teaching my own class in grad school in Indiana. I had on my best suit. Oh, I was clean. You couldn't tell me nothing. I had a briefcase. I went and bought my Sunday best shoes. I was ready, right? I was like, I've been ready for this moment. I get on the elevator, and students were getting on and off. And some students got off, and it was me and a woman now on the elevator. I was going up to the 7th floor. It was like 10 floors in this building. And she clutched her purse and moved it to the other side. Can you all believe that? I'm in a suit. I'm in my Sunday's best. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, I dressed up for this day. And I remember looking at her and I said, nobody wants your purse, lady. And I got off the elevator, but you know the problem? I don't remember my first lecture. She stole that moment from me. All I remember is that incident. That's a problem. And after that, I said I would never let anyone steal my shine. I would never let anyone steal my moments from me. And we do that too much, right? Partly because we get to drink the Kool-Aid, start thinking we the magical Negro. For example, I told this story to one of my colleagues he was another grad student, who isn't in grad school anymore. This is important as to why he's not, right? And he goes, well, I hear you, but I mean, I took the picture on my license in a suit and tie. So I mean, when I get pulled over, the cops are gonna see that. I said, no, we were at a bar. I said, hey bro, you got on a white t-shirt and a ball cap. Nobody cares whether or not you have on a suit or not when you go out in public or at night, right? Your skin tone speaks your attire for you, right? It doesn't matter what you have on. So part of it is that people get to drinking the Kool-Aid, not realizing that our public interactions, this racial tax we have, is what links us together across the socioeconomic rating. So as I was telling the class earlier today, it's the reason why I bond more with the person who picks up my trash than I do with the professor who's in the office beside me. because we share a very different experience than I share with my colleague beside me. We live very different lives when we go home. We come from very different places, right? And when you start forgetting that, you drunk the Kool-Aid and they got you. Because now they can put you in a position and say, we're not going to have any problem out of that natural Negro. They drunk the Kool-Aid, right? They think they're one of us, right? And by that, I'm really talking about the system, right? And in many ways, I think we forget that racism is systemic in a way that, in responding to whether or not people need to be educated, there's a paper by Mary Jackman and you. It's one of my favorite papers from the early 80s. They pushed this concept called sophisticated practitioners. What they found was that the more educated whites were, the more savvy and sophisticated they were at not seeming like they're racist. They just had a better language for it, right? I found the same thing with gender, right? So I took that concept, did it with gender. Men who are more savvy, we just have a better language for not saying like we're sexist, right? But we do it, at the end we want the same thing, right? Which is not to give up power, but try to get somebody in bed, right? So don't think people talking all this stuff to you that it's going to be a different outcome. Right? So the visceral reactions, when we think about education, what we don't realize, and I know Paul is going to talk about this, that visceral reactions and emotions are often unpredictable. Right? It's hard to quantify it. It's hard to predict it. So this is what Eduardo's talking about with sociology. Like, I love numbers. I love numbers and words. I analyze them. But it's hard to predict emotions. And implicit bias and cognitive dissonance meaning you are faced with evidence, but you fight your best to say that it doesn't matter. That takes something very, very strong to be able to do that, right? And white supremacy does that. And it's not just whites who buy into it. I think that's the point with the clothing and those sorts of things. All of us buy into this system. All of us buy into paternalism, patriarchy, white supremacy. And unfortunately, in higher education, one thing you got to realize, this is one of the most conservative institutions we got, right? It's difficult to change these institutions, right? And so I think we have to remember that these things are key, that emotions are something that's very difficult to quantify, and people get very savvy at how they do things.
So I just have a couple of things to add about this idea that education is the cure to racism. So I came here from Romania. I was born and raised in Bucharest, and I came here when I was 10 years old. But when you come from a foreign country, you don't necessarily understand all the codes, right? You kind of like trying to find your way, you don't speak the language, so you put a lot on yourself as like, okay, it must be me, I don't understand. So one distinct memory I have is that as soon as I got here, there would be like these sort of, I grew up in a kind of, at the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, primarily like white, middle class to, working class kind of neighborhood. And I remember very clearly, there would be these whispers, right? Like, you're not supposed to go there. And I was this like curious person, right? Like I wanted to know everything and I wanted to talk to anybody, right? Just this was my personality, right? And I remember how the feeling of moving from one racial space, the predominantly white space, into like a non-white space, I remember how it felt, the feeling would shift, right? But all the whites over here would be like, and I'd be like, wow, and I really felt very powerfully, because we went to this Lutheran church that was all white, and everybody was like, hello, and this hi, and it was like a very performance of happiness, right? Of like, you are immigrants, we will speak to you slowly, we are happy people, welcome, Jesus loves you, right? And I was like, why are they talking about that? Because to me, it was like, okay, you're hiding something, because you sound like you're trying too hard, right? To say something. And I was like, what's the secret? Like, am I not in on the plate? Like, is the curtain gonna finally come down and they're gonna be like, okay, now you're talking for real, like, be real and be honest, And so this whole time I'm on like, it must be me, I'm foreign, I don't get it. It must be me, I'm foreign, I don't get it. And each time I would go to sort of spaces where there were people of color, they'd be looking at me like, what are you doing here? Right? Like there was this like, You're in the wrong, do you know where you are? Like,
Make a wrong
what,
turn.
did you make a wrong turn? I remember I was in this, and this continued, right? Like, for a long time. I remember being, I was a student outside of Philadelphia at Swarthmore. I lived in West Philadelphia. The one time I went running, like, in the other direction, right? Like, not towards UPenn, but towards deeper into the ghetto. This black man stops me, he's like, woman, you better turn around. Because I was like, I'm gonna go jogging, like, stupid white woman, like, and it was so clear, right? Like the divides were so clear. But here's the point. I didn't know why. Nobody, in all the, imagine I'm getting the most elite education in America, right? Like in high school, pretty good high school, public school, I got to Swarthmore and then they told me how bad my public schooling was. But I get to Swarthmore and I'm like, I'm gonna study philosophy because they're gonna give me the why. Why are things like this, right? And the deeper I go into my education, the deeper the problem gets concealed. Because what is education in America? It is indoctrination, it is miseducation. And nobody's sitting there telling you the real story of how things got to be the way they are, what the real causes of these inequalities are, what the real causes of the social segregation are, right? So finally, I say a miracle, because imagine how much seeking you have to do as a white person to actually get and chance upon somebody who actually tells you the real history. And the only space that happens, and I'm sorry, is in ethnic studies classes. Or if you happen to be in a sociology class with these kinds of scholars, right? And that is not the norm of education, right? That's going to be the anomaly. That's the people who snuck in and decided to make an alternative education space. So I'm sitting in George Lutz's class, and he's teaching me about, redlining and ghettoization. And I have this moment like, oh my God, I get it, right? Because he showed me how it all came about. And it was actually really simple. And I was like, y'all have been concealing this from me for 17 years in all my educational pursuits. And so, what is my point? My point is, number one, what kind of education are we talking about as the cure for racism? Because it was the cure. I'm not saying I'm not invested in racism still, because I am. Obviously it's impossible to live in a society as a white person and not continue to be. But what I'm trying to say is that I got the right education. I chanced upon this miraculous convergence of people who had mercy on me to explain the real history. And then finally, I was one of those people like, right? But then the real work had to start, because my whole worldview fell apart. Everything, all the, like James Baldwin says, the stars and the moons moved out of their coordinates, and I had to remake my whole sense of self. Now, most white folks and most people in power of any privilege will not want to do that deep inner work that it requires to understand that even if you didn't ask for it, you have blood on your hands. Like, I literally inherited blood money. And I keep getting the benefits from it, and now I'm trying to figure out how to leverage my own power, right, to kind of atone for that. It's a really deep question for me, both spiritually and practically. And what I'm trying to say is that when does education matter? It matters to those who are receptive to it. It certainly doesn't matter to those people who are gonna keep believing and have selective hearing and be like in my classes, learning the history that I'm teaching, because I now will become one of those teachers that tries to teach the real history. But guess what? I still have folks that walk away unscathed. Like, the best I can hope is that they will not pretend like they're ignorant still. And that now they have a moral and ethical dilemma to confront, and in the midnight hour, they're going to know, okay, I'm choosing to continue as racism. That's my best hope, right? Because I can't make anyone go to the other side. You know what I mean? That's something everybody has to choose for themselves. What I'm trying to say is that I'm interested in what creates the receptivity to education, to the right knowledge, right? The truthful knowledge. And I still haven't figured that out. Two things I've seen in my teaching is that people who have some kind of spiritual framework are usually more receptive to the knowledge or to the prospect of introspection, right? And I'm talking about examining your own privilege and examining your own power. And two, people who are recently immigrants from some place, because they haven't been as deeply indoctrinated into the feeling of the lie, right, into the feeling of white supremacy, might be open in a weird sort of way in kind of hearing something else, right? And the third thing is that the most often I've ever seen education matter in terms of the receptivity, creating the kind of emotional willingness to hear and do that difficult self-work, is when deep friendships form. And based on those friendships, you as a person in power, as a person in privilege, start asking questions because you start seeing the world through their eyes, right? Now, those friendships rarely get cultivated. Why? Because we live in segregated worlds. Like Rashawn said, at the end of the day, everybody goes back to their segregated, racially segregated churches, racially segregated temples, mosques, everything else, right? And schools and homes and neighborhoods. How does one get the courage to cross the line? You know, when does somebody get to put themselves in an uncomfortable social situation enough to just ask innocent questions like, I don't know what the real causes are for this deep inequality. I'd like to know. I'm here to learn, you know. And for me, the friendships are an entry point, right, into just at the very least asking questions. But for that, we need to create more spaces where people are actually talking to each other across race, across gender, across sexualities, across all these notions of difference.
Okay, I'm going to ask them one more question, and after this series of responses, I want to invite the audience to come up and ask the question. We have a mic set up here in front, and whoever asks the first question, I would ask them to click it on because the mic is currently off. I'm going to ask them a question, and then after that, again, we're going to open this up to the audience for wider engagement. When I first got here, I have a girl and a boy. My son was about 12 years old, 11 or 12. And I was all excited because the street that we lived on was a rainbow coalition of humanity. We had Jamaicans, we had Haitians, we had Cubans, we had Dominicans, we had Puerto Ricans. And I just, I would look out my door, my kids would be running around in all of these shades of brown and black. And there was actually only one self-identified white family on the street. And it was like my son became fond of saying, Dad, in down here, even the white people ain't white. Even the white people. Little white girl, Casey, very, very sweet little girl, had a crush on my son. And my son didn't have a crush on her. He liked her, didn't have a crush on her. But there was a Cuban kid, let's call him Carlos, who, I think that's actually his name, who had a crush on Casey. So my son comes in one day, and I'll tell you a story about my son, and I'll tell you a story about my daughter, and then I'm going to present the question. So my son comes in and he says, Dad, there's something wrong with Carlos. And I said, what's wrong with Carlos? He says, Carlos thinks he's white. I said, what are you talking about? He said, Carlos came up to me and I knew that Carlos likes Casey. And Carlos said, you know that you and Casey cannot be boyfriend and girlfriend. And then Elijah, he was 12, he said, I don't want to be Casey's boyfriend. But being my son, he said, but I could be anybody's boyfriend that I want to be. Let's be clear about that. And he said, and by the way, why can't I be Casey's boyfriend if I want to be? He said, because you're black and she's white. And the Bible says, right, this is like an 11-year-old. The Bible says interracial coupling is evil. You'll go to hell. And my son said, I guess so we can't date Casey, can we? And he said, what do you mean? I'm white. And my son said, you are darker than I am. Like you're literally darker than I am. He said, where are you from? He said, I'm from Cuba. He said, you don't think that you're Cuban? How does that work? And he said, no, I am white. And my son literally said, I think there's something wrong with Carlos. My daughter she was getting ready to have her hair plaited, and so I had to take the plaits out that she had, and our appointment was the next day. So I've taken my daughter's hair out, so she has this beautiful afro, and we blow it out, you know, and she goes outside. A couple things happen. One, my Jamaican neighbors are like, "Is everything okay?" What are you talking about? Is everything okay? Your daughter's hair, is everything okay? I was like, no, it's just hair coming out of her head, right? Oh, and she gets it done tomorrow. Oh, okay. She had been playing with this little Dominican girl. My daughter comes out with her afro. The little Dominican girl says, "I can't play with you anymore." My daughter said, "What do you mean you can't play with me anywhere?" "Because of your hair. My mom said that I cannot play with ghetto children." My daughter comes in and she's crying. She says, my friend Maria, she doesn't, she called me ghetto and about my hair, and I'm crushed, right? Because this brown humanity, this black humanity, and this is what's coming back to me. Eduardo, you talk about at one point you worked the Latin Americanization of whiteness. How do we think about not just how white people have internalized white supremacy and how that is deployed and informs the decisions that we make, and in some cases can be even emotionally lethal to us? How do we think about how that is extended out into communities of color in which whiteness becomes a capital that they invest in and deploy in these certain kinds of ways, so that people that may look like you or be dark or some shade of brown may be thinking and enforcing the same type of white supremacist ideology as those people that we generally think about as white. So can you speak to that? And then after the panelists' answers, I invite people to come to the mic.
Yeah, the logic of white supremacy has affected everybody, not just Latinos. So the same results are also within the black community. Yeah? The African American community also has its color strong. Yeah? The lighter you are, there you are. Yeah? And we have systematic data showing that phenotype matters. And it matters because who controls the game? White folks. Yeah? So they are the ones who make decisions about, you are better, I like more Beyonce than I like this other dark.
That's right.
Okay, in Latin America, of course, given the level of racial mixing, it's important to understand that in the US, everybody has one drop rules, except that we reverse the order. In the US, a drop of black blood makes you black. In Latin America and the Caribbean, a drop of white blood. So you can always say, my great was quite different.
Yeah.
Even though phenotypically you may look black. But black is this construction, yeah? Mm-hmm. And then let me expand the discussion. Yes, so you talk about the Cuban and the Dominican family sort of reproducing Jamaican white supremacist arguments. Nothing new on that. The Jamaican is interesting because let me give you an example that may blow the mind of some folks here who don't know enough about the Caribbean. So you read countries like Haiti as monoracial, yeah? You presume that they are black, except that that's not the way that race is lived in Haiti. In Haiti, there is also a core gradation following the norms of white supremacy. So the mulatto class, yeah, the lighter members of what you would call the black community, are sort of the ruling elite, yeah? And they talk about black people that sometimes they call the Africans, yeah? The same way, in the nasty language, that white folks talk about us in this country, yeah? So the importance of that is that logic then keeps sort of being pushed down the groups, and it affects the individual level. So something that is important for me in terms of developing a policy of resistance in the Caribbean is that one of the impediments for us to develop race consciousness and to develop social movements based on race consciousness is that within the family. So in the US, you talk about the black family. In Latin America and the Caribbean, it's really hard to talk about the black family. Because families are, so you can have one family, let me use my own example, my own family. Black father, he cannot claim to be anything else. He's black. It's as we say, eres negro teléfono, you're black as a telephone. All the people in the room remember when you have these black telephones. Yeah? So in Puerto Rico, to be black, you have to be really, really black. Okay. My mother is a confused mulata. Yeah? God bless her, but confused as they come. My brother came out, and this is a sort of genetic rooted. My brother came out looking sort of Indian. Of course, with some African features, yeah? My sister, light skin, but as we say in Puerto Rico, con un pelo más. Bad hair, yeah? So it's like, if you can do something about the hair, you know. She's sort of pretty, you know. No, it's a little bit like, you know. So everything, for us in the taxonomy of race, everything counts. So in the US, you folks seem to be obsessive about skin tone. Latin America, everything counts. Hair texture, nose, money, of course, money whiteness. Culture matters, everything. And as a kid, I remember, again, the white supremacy affects all of us. So we all fight about, you know, if I had to get out ojitos verdes, if I had green eyes. So those of you Latinos in the group know about, you know. And again, the genetic roots can produce situations where you have a person who can be mild complexion with green eyes. That person then automatically you cannot be black. Yeah? Even if your hair is pelo malo, bad hair, you know. So that then prevents all that to tell you that it is really hard for us to develop these we blacks. Because even within the family, which is central for the formation of race identity in the US, you can have like my own family, where my family, my parents were telling me that I was un negrito acomplejado, a black man with a complex. Yeah? Because as a kid, the same experience you talk about your daughter and son, I got similar stuff. Yeah? As the darkie in my family, I got all the experiences in high school, etc. And all they wanted to, you know, I remember reading the little, I had a bad summer, so I started reading all these novelas, you know, for women. Yeah? And I read like 50 of them. Corinthian, all people in the room, Corinthian. Okay, you know Corinthian? He also had issues. Okay. So anyway, so I was happy because in these little novelas, they said that the leading man, the man that, you know, they describe him as tall, dark, and handsome. It took me to read 50 of them to realize that by dark they meant European dark. It crushed my stomach. Because then I would never be able to be that. Yeah? All this to talk about the complexity of race formation, but I wanted to then extend the discussion to one, what is happening, again, nothing new under the sun. Colorism has been part of the Latino and the African American community. And my claim in that argument that I made some years ago is that logic of color that has been central to the American experience is becoming increasingly more important. And that you will have people that today you may call black, but in 10, 15, 20 years, they may migrate out of blackness and call themselves biracial, multiracial, call me American, call me just a human being. Yeah? And who knows? And maybe at some point, depending on how race evolves in the US, they may even call themselves just white. Yeah? Or don't call me anything. We can even eliminate, as we did in my country, and many Caribbean countries, we can even eliminate collecting data on race. We can say we are so colorblind that we don't need data on race because we're all Americans. Anyone from Latin America or the Caribbean knows that that's the way we talk about race. We don't have, no tenemos eso aquí. Eso es en Estados Unidos. We are all here the same. We are all Cuban. We're all Puerto Ricans. We don't need to connect, and if you collect data on race, then you are the racist. Powerful stuff.
You go.
So I mean, I think about a few things. I mean, your stories make me think about one of my friends who called me a few years ago, said that his daughter was in kindergarten, first grade, and she went to school with Afro Puffs, and she got called Mickey Mouse or Minnie Mouse, like in a derogatory fashion, and came home crying. And so you think about at that age, the fact that people know to call someone something like that, and then to more or less also talk about race in a particular way that leads to parents having to make a decision about what they're going to do. So the point is that it starts very early, and I think this is what David is getting at. I think it oftentimes starts a whole lot earlier than we want to admit. Even people like us who study this, right? Because now all of a sudden you have to have a conversation with your child. We were talking about this over lunch. Now all of a sudden you have to have a conversation with your child that you weren't necessarily ready for. I have a 4 and a 5-year-old and have to have these sort of conversations. And I think there are a couple of things to mention. So just statistically, obviously people are more likely to be successful as it relates to education, the job that they have, income, and wealth. But there are also some other interesting studies. So for example, the lighter you are, the more likely you are to be married, particularly for women. There was a study showing that the lighter you are, there was a study in North Carolina, an actual study of prisoners, found that the lighter you were, you spent less time in prison, and for the same offense, you actually got less time in jail, right? So those are two different things. First, you got a lighter sentence. Then when you went to prison, even when you were sentenced for the same amount of time, you got out earlier, right? Holding all else constant. So that's what skin tone does. So what that means is people who are darker see that. They understand that. And they say, oh, so if I change something about me, then that would actually change the outcome for me. This is the reason why skin bleaching creams are so popular, not just in the United States, but around the world, particularly in Africa and India and Asia, right? This is the reason why you see a lot of Asians walking around with umbrellas, because they don't want to be darker, right? Because the currency you get for being lighter is global, right? This is a globalized phenomenon. It really stems from this westernization of beauty that we have about what's better than something else. Right? And that's what made Beyonce's song just so powerful, right? The song in the video, right? I mean, she said, I want to get it right. She was just on point, right? She was like, my daddy Alabama, mama Louisiana, you mix that Negro with the Creole, make it Texas Bama. I like my baby hair with baby hair and afros. I like my Negro nose with Jackson 5 nostrils. I mean, she's essentially saying be proud of who you are, and not, you don't necessarily have to apologize for that. However, people's accommodationalist strategies, as bad as we might think they are actually rational.
Yes.
They're very rational. And I think sometimes we have to realize that. If you see someone getting something who's lighter skinned than you, and you realize that it's systemic, then you might say, I want to be that. Right? This is the reason why, as David, we were talking about this yesterday, this is the reason why the fact that black women have the highest self-esteem of basically all groups is one of the most fascinating things to stop.
Fascinating.
Doesn't make sense. People are like, no, this doesn't make sense. Part of that is, if you don't have that, then what do you have? Right? And the academy can make you lose that. Right? And unfortunately what happens is some minorities feel that they have to do that to succeed. And then that they must continue to accommodate. So the people who live in your neighborhood, those who get success, actually then walk more gingerly to keep it. Right? There were studies done in the 70s looking at popular girls in high school and professional women in professional settings. What they found was that they actually accommodated more. Right? So even the most popular girls. So if you all seen the movie Mean Girls, raise your hand, seen Mean Girls. Think about what they did to each other. Just think about that movie. It's a great sociological, social psychological process to think about. Right? I use it in my classes. Because it was all this infighting, it was all this, I have to maintain the top spot, and everybody's looking at them like they're the best. But they accommodate so much. And that's what success does. It makes you accommodate. Right? They want us to keep seeing this small window of what it means to be successful, and then they got us. Now we've accommodated. Now we won't challenge the system. And then not only will we won't challenge the system, then we'll socialize our children not to challenge it either. We'll socialize our friends. The other people who are younger than us in school, we'll socialize everybody. We want to be successful. You gotta keep your mouth shut. You gotta keep your head down. You just gotta walk straight. They over there protesting, don't do all that. Right? That's why I love living in Oakland, actually. I lived out there for a couple years. They would protest anything. Shoes, like the fact that like something random closed down that they weren't even a part of. Like literally, like people would be like, "I'm gonna protest this," and people just start joining in, just walking down the street protesting. And I'm just like, "Do you know we protest?" No, I don't even know. I just know it's
Down for the cause.
Yeah, I'm just down for the cause. And so I mean, I think that we forget what mobilization actually does. And we get so caught up in being the magical person that it leads to us being invested in our own individuality, which means we can't mobilize. We don't view mobilization as something we should do. And when we do that, they got us, right? They give you your little house, they give you your little car, they give you your little paycheck, and all of a sudden you let things go with the status quo and then you turn your back on people who were like you, who, coming from where I come from, there were tons of people smarter than me. Tons of people smarter than me. I was just one of the people who ended up getting certain opportunities that they didn't get. It wasn't because I was smarter than them. But if I start thinking I'm smarter than them, then all of a sudden they got us.
So this issue really hits very, very personally and very closely to me because I have a biracial daughter and she's 8 months old. And you know, her father's African American and I am who I am. And you know, already everywhere I go with her, race is on my mind, right? Everywhere we go with her, we cannot avoid it. I mean, from the look, you're just walking down the street, you know, I don't know if all of you follow astrology, my partner has a Scorpio moon, he senses everything, like, real deep down, right? So he just be reading people's gazes, right? Just white men coming out of the elevator, who looks we get. Then, you know, passing on the street, who's moving over, who's making us move over, in what way. I mean, just like these little sensibilities, right? And what the level of communication on this, like, non-verbal, just feeling basis. We went to Whole Foods to get some baby food, you know what that looks like. So what I'm trying to say is that when I look at her, and she's got this innocence right now, right? Where she loves both of us so deeply, and you can tell, and she's like, and I can just feel it coming, right? Like I can just feel the loss of innocence coming, right? Because, you know, the way she looks, and you know, you still don't know really what she's gonna end up looking like, and she's still evolving, but I know that she could get it from both sides. You know, she's not white enough to necessarily fit, just like people are like, what is she? You know, she's not. And again, she could also pass in some people's eyes, and then in other people's eyes, right, she could also not be perceived as not belonging to being black, right? Like, you do like to be black. You can't claim that, right? So I remember reading, you know, this amazing essay, Passing for White, Passing for Black, by Adrian Piper, who is an African-American woman who passes for white, right? But she identifies and has always identified as African-American. It's other people who impose the whiteness on her. She talks about getting the pain from both sides, right? The lack of acceptance on both sides, the non-belonging, like always being in this in-between, and the deep pain that you get from sort of always being in this kind of like, you know, kind of liminal state, right? Which is not something to bemoan, right? It's something to kind of, that disrupts everybody's paradigms, right? Like the nice classification is one of the things that multiracial people disrupt, and therefore, then the problem becomes like, well, what are you? What's your daddy? What's your mama? Like, trying to place the person, right? My deepest hope, I guess, for her is that she'll have such a strong sense of self and rootedness in who she is, and not just in her different kind of, you know, ethnic and racial and natural and cultural backgrounds, but that her sense of self politically will be so evolved by the time she's 3 that, you know, on the playground, things are going to get down, and she's going to know, like, and that's what I'm hoping. By 3, no, I mean, but seriously, that's when it starts, right? Like, it's not even like, oh, I can wait until she talks. Like, she's already getting the looks, and she's already getting the weird vibes from certain people, and other vibes from other people, and people touching her hair to be like, ooh, is it coming out straight? It's coming out straight. It's coming out, you know, and then like just all these kinds of things that I'm already thinking about. And my best friend, who's African American, had a biracial child. We came up in grad school, and her little daughter was 2 years old, you know, when we started out in grad school, and just seeing the experiences that she as a black mother had to go through with a biracial child, right? That's lighter than her, has like blonder hair, light eyes, and so on and so forth, but clearly black, you know. And it's like, yeah, like getting, like you're the mother, you're being called the nanny. I mean, I cannot go through all the stories, like deep, painful suffering, right? And at the same time, if you see who this young lady has evolved into, because her mother is her mother, you know, is that the poise, the self-identification, the knowing who she is, right? At the same time, always in tension with this question of belonging and wanting to fit in, you know, which is very normal, you know. And so I'm anticipating all of that to come, but at the same time, I guess the main thing I want to tell my daughter is, you have such unique sight because of this crazy paradigm that this racist country has constructed, that you have, for some reason, are now, you know, this is a cross to bear, right, to walk with, but at the same time, it's something that gives you very unique sight into what the paradigms are and why they're falsely constructed, right, or why they're real but false, right, and so on and so forth. And my greatest hope for her is that she'll use that, right? She'll use that in a way that is beautifully useful to other people and to herself and so on and so forth. But, you know, if somebody messes with my baby, you know, I mean, it's a good thing I don't believe in buying guns, because, I mean, it's just, there's a level of parental love that you have about the kind of, and you can't protect her, you know, because you know there's going to be instances where you're not there to defend her. But best believe they better not come and mess with my child, because I don't know what I would do, you know. And I think about Tamir Rice's mother, I think about Trayvon's mother, I think about, you know, and those are the most extreme cases, obviously, but you also have these everyday cases, and the fathers, right? And the need to protect, but not necessarily being able to in every instance, right? And I don't know where I'm going with this except to say, this generation, and hopefully my daughter's generation, will hopefully inherit a much deeper savviness about how this stuff works. And instead of, you know, people fighting each other, as Audre Lorde would say, in horizontal aggressions, let's focus on, you know, those in the vertical, you know, power structure, and get to the, you know, get to nip the monster in the head, if you will, you know. And instead of channeling our aggression and our, you know, the incredible long-term effect of this suffering, right? Let's, instead of spreading it to our most intimate partners, right? Which is usually where the aggression is directed towards our children, our partners, or, you know, that's where it actually lives, right? Let's actually figure out how to come together to kind of keep challenging that vertical structure, right? A very difficult work to do. But I guess once you see it, you know, hopefully, you know, you start channeling it upwards instead of downwards. So that's my greatest hope. I don't have a good answer though. Yeah, it's a very difficult question.
All right, come to the mic, ask the question. Make sure you cut it on. There you go.
Good evening. My question is about, we know that media is a perpetrator of status quo. And if we want to fight social injustice, we have to look at our media and see how they're continuously keep this oppression and injustice patterns with no representativity of oppressed elements like class or gender or race. And my question is how to fight that, and even more now when on the internet is a good tool for fighting, but it's a good tool to perpetrate this oppression, and with memes and jokes that people just perceive as, it's just a joke. Why are you so fussy about it? How do we fight that?
I'll start. So, you know, what's interesting about media is that there are 5 main media conglomerates. and they own literally everything you see. And what that means is there are 5 central corporations that own basically all of the news channels that we see on TV. Well, first you can just search it, and you can click images, and a really nice map will pop up to see what people own. So like Disney and ABC and ESPN, that's one example, right? That's the reason why when you're watching, well, I watch a lot of sports, so when I'm watching sports, commercials for ABC will pop up. That's the reason if you're watching, I think it's NBC. Hold on, what channel does NCIS come on? That's CBS, right? CBS. Okay, so if you notice, the stuff that comes on there also comes on TNT and TBS, right? So that's like an example. So you have these main media conglomerates. And what that means is that we're dealing with a structure similar to airlines, where only a few people own and work resources, right? This is the reason why airlines can kind of do what they want to do. So media can kind of do what they want to do. In order to kind of break that down, we have to get back to a point, and this was happening a couple of decades ago, right? And then you go back to kind of right after the Civil Rights Movement, it was also happening again. But we started to see more diversification, right? Because the thing about media, what we see also impacts what we listen to, right? So the radio stations are also owned in a similar way. So social media circumvents that. But I also wonder what happens when social media becomes commodified, right? And I think that's the big issue is, eventually like Facebook, it's a publicly traded company. As we were saying yesterday, have you noticed, raise your hand, you got a Facebook account. Have you noticed that only certain things pop up on your Facebook page? That's because people like us or corporations are actually studying you. Have you noticed you're starting to get ads? Have you noticed that you'll search something on your laptop and then the ad will pop up on Facebook? Right? So we are being studied, right? And all these people are working together. And I think the way that we deal with it is we have to first stop giving them our money. That's the first thing. Second, then we have to come up with new portals and new avenues for new forms of entertainment and expression and news, right? And there were certain times when we had that. So take BT, right, before Bob Johnson sold it. But they made him such a good deal, he was like, I'm just gonna have to sell it. And he was pretty accommodationist anyway. But I think BET was something very different a couple of decades ago than it is today, right? Today it's just a coonish TV, right? And so you have these sort of outcomes where I think in order to do it, in order to kind of fight this media homogeneity, we have to create other spaces, right? I think people have started to do that through online portals. So for example, people now, so you have online news where you can actually go and get news that's very appropriate. So for example, interestingly, Al Gore had a really popular station. It went live, it didn't go well, they went back online. I'll think of the name of it. But it's those sort of avenues that I think have to happen. I think the media is highly problematic, but I also think that in many ways the media is a reflection of what's already happening on the ground, right? The media just kind of showcases it, gives us a mirror of a way to look at it. I think of the media, it's kind of like the flame is already going, the fire is already lit, and it's simply, like when you grill it out, if you like me, you grill out, but you like lighter fluid, and you throw that light, it just flames up everywhere. That's what the media is, right? And so I think we have to create new portals, new avenues, meaning we need our own radio stations, we need our own news, we need our own entertainment, right? Something very different. Like something that I think will be very popular is positive news. It's all these great things going on, but you watch the news, when you think that crime is increasing just by watching the news? The crime rate has significantly been dropping for the past 2 decades, right? But the news gives us a very different story. If somebody came out with positive news, I think a lot of people will watch it because I think people are tired of negativity. But instead, what we try to do is we try to get into the same system that oppresses us instead of creating something different.
Questions?
Hi, good evening. I have a question. I was speaking with a white friend earlier today about Flint and other problems in America, in which she attempted to remove race from the discussion. So how would you address that? Because it is very obvious that racism is at the root of a lot of American problems and problems in the world, and she's very negligent to
Very
see
well.
that negligent. She doesn't want to see that racism is actually a factor in the things that happen. So how would you go ahead and start that conversation?
She Puerto Rican. So we have a name for that, for the colorblind racism, yeah. And that is a post-civil rights way of thinking and processing race matters. That's why I said that although we have Trump, whoever is not colorblind, although Trump wants to have it both ways, ethno-nationalists at the same time is like, I love Mexicans, I love Muslims, I love everybody, yeah. So he wants to have it both ways, yeah. In that, the Klan people are like, well, no, we don't. We like the other part of you, not this part. So this language that we have developed in the last 40, 50 years is central, yeah, because it's eliminating race from the equation, yeah, and at the same time reinserting race in a different way. So your friend says race, I'm not a racist, but yeah. So my best friends are black, and after that they go crazy, yeah. I don't know the names of my best friends who are black, but let me tell you what I know of black people. Yeah? So this sort of discourse of race has nothing to do with anything. Yeah? I was telling them a story before about having a discussion with one of my colleagues on this concept of microaggressions. Some of you have heard, yeah? And it's basically the little insults and slights that we face all the time in stores, in the streets, from regular folks, you know. And he basically came to tell me that he thinks it's bullshit. And his claim was basically that there is no intent in these matters. And he had a whole political argument. He said, if you guys continue with this hypersensitivity, then you will not be able to deal with the real deep race issues, like Trump. And I'm like, you know what? Trump is not as bad as he is. He's not my main target. I'm more concerned with people like you. Because for every Trump, there are like 3 or 4 of you who tell me I'm not a racist, I don't see race, etc. And they're the ones who ultimately support the racial order of things today. So therefore, I'm not saying that we ignore the Klan or Trump. I'm saying again, do the math and do the political analysis of where should I put most of my energy. Yeah? The more we focus, again, I'm not saying ignore. I'm not saying ignore Trump or the Klan. We can't. Yeah? But at the same time, don't give a pass to the white majority who may be singing a different colorblind tune, which I think is more effective, and it is the dominant way in which we transact race matters in contemporary America.
Yeah. So if I had a penny for every time a white person said that class is more important than race, I'd be rich by now. But I want to kind of just speak very strategically, right? Because this comes up very often, especially in higher education. Number one, and this is kind of, you know, my work is on this, right? Like, what kind of receptivity does this white person that you were talking to have to actually listening and integrating knowledge? If you see that they are dead set on their viewpoint, chances are that there's this, what I call the kind of emotional foreclosure. It doesn't matter what kind of evidence you're going to give, all the sociologists that you're going to cite, and show her charts and studies, and she's still going to be like, yeah, but, right? And that's that cognitive dissonance, or like basically what's happening there. This is from the internal perspective of a white person's kind of worldview, right? Is that what you're asking her to do is change the way she sees the world, right? And that would require a lot of work, not only in educating herself to see things differently and re-educating herself on how she's been taught to see things, right? But it would require a self-analysis. Where am I in this, right? And the avoidance of the race question is an attempt to close the door at the prospect that you might call her a racist. That's all it is. Because to white people, what it is that if you call me a racist, you're calling me bad. And if you call me bad, I'm going to feel bad about myself. And I don't want to feel that way, right? And so what ends up happening there is, one, strategically for you, for your energy and your emotional energy and your intellectual energy, assess whether that person has any kind of sincere receptivity to what you have to say. If they do not, I would say don't waste your time.
Walk.
It's walk away. It's not worth it, right? It's the same thing as me trying to be like, literally at the time I got into a wrestling match with my brother because I was so upset about the racist things that he was saying. We went into a fist fight because that's how bad it got, right? It's like, in retrospect, probably shouldn't have tried it any further, right? But I was so upset with what he was saying, I kept trying to push it. Finally, when the words start failing, you get into a fist fight. That's with your brother, Hopefully not. I did actually. Thank you very much. And so I pulled an Aikido move on him. I swear he wasn't expecting. But anyway, the second thing I would say is decide whether sometimes, even though the person is not receptive, and you know that, and you can see that, they're closed up, whether on principle for yourself, not for them, but for yourself, you have to interrupt the live. That's on a day when you're feeling like, you know what, I'm just gonna mess up this white person for a second and just interrupt the logic, because I know what they will feel it, even though they will refuse you and go crazy and start crying or whatever they're gonna do. But maybe for your sake, you decide I have to interrupt this logic, right? Because I'm not willing to let you believe that you can walk, that I'm by my silence complicit in what it is you want me to say. But strategically, you might not want to fight that day because it's exhausting, right? Especially if it's in a class and whatever, and the professor's not supporting you, and they're going to kind of go over it real fast, and now you're all by yourself feeling bad all day, right? So pick your battles is the point. The second thing I would say is, one of the things that has worked for me in terms of dealing primarily with white folks, who's primarily who I worked with, right, in terms of anti-racist work, is make sure that it's a long-term engagement. When I get them in a class, and they bring up this kind of stuff in week 1, I'll say, okay, let's raise that question in week 13 once we've studied redlining. And now you've had to read, right, the history, and you've had to listen to it, and you had to hear testimonies about it from students of color, and then you've had to do this and that, and at some point in the semester, right, because of that long-term engagement, and because I got them in the classroom and they have to read, right, then the evidence is undeniable. They can't just pull shit out of the air and call that a good opinion, because that's like, actually, you're wrong, factually, right? And so, but you can't just say that in a bar, because in a bar, the person's like, whatever about what you think you know, I think I know too. So then it's an equivocation that actually you can't sustain, right, in that moment, right? If you can get somebody to agree to a long-term engagement with the question, and the good evidence is presented, right, then a different thing will happen, which is it will be irrefutable that race and class in America are forever entangled, right? That there's undeniable, you cannot disentangle the two, right? And if you know that historically and how it came about, then the person might still refute it, but they'll look like a fool, right? Because now you done gone through this whole process, right? So then the question becomes, when that refusal happens, just know, what's at stake, as Baldwin would say, is not that white people don't know any better, but that the price, the danger to themselves, is to have to give up who they are. Because really, to be perfectly frank, if you study American history and the way that race and class are entangled, as a white person, the only conclusion you can come to is reparations. I gotta give up some shit. That's what it comes. It's so obvious. It's like I won all these advantages through discrimination, exploitation, and bloodshed. I get them automatically whether I ask for them or not. Therefore, the only question that remains is, what am I going to do with my advantages? Right? Am I going to redistribute or am I going to hoard them? I mean, that's what it comes down to. There is so much labor that goes into avoiding that final encounter, that question, avoiding the process that it will take you to if you actually engage in historical evidence, right? So there are so many sophisticated white tactics to avoid that question, even if somebody doesn't know all this stuff. It will just be on a visceral level, like on the gut level, right? Like, I'm just gonna not engage this question before it even begins, because you might begin to accuse me. What have you accused me of? Well, there's some legit stuff to accuse me of, right? So then the problem becomes, it's like, to avoid that question, I gotta make sure to not even have it come up. And that to me is the way, like, class versus, race and so on. So, just a strategy that even I go through you know, to kind of be like, do I want to go into this right now? And you always have to decide, you know, whether is it worth it to you.
So yeah, that was great. Again, I mean, two quick things. When people admit that race matters, and this is exactly what Paul is getting at. When people admit that race matters, then they either they realize that they're privileged and didn't make it on their own, which is something that's very difficult to do, and or then they must do something about racism in order to strive toward their ideal, which is colorblindness. That's extremely problematic for people to do, right? With friends, I'll tell you what I do. Particularly if we're at a bar or it's a place where I'm like, I'm not really going to be able to have this conversation. I'll listen to them. I get all the information I need. I'm collecting data. And I go, tell me more. I ask them questions. And they're just telling me, I'm like, because it's the thing with friends, you don't have to respond today or tonight. This is a long-term relationship. And if you're truly friends, you can agree to disagree, right? But over time, you want to move the pendulum. So a lot of people, you plant seeds, right? And so you figure out what you're going to do tonight. So I put it in my head, instead of beating my head against the wall, I'm just gathering intel. And then I send them stuff. And I don't say, read this because you racist as hell. No, I just send it to them and I say, hey, I was reading something that was interesting. What do you think about it?
It's called a possessive investment in what?
Yeah. What do you think about this? And then they read it. We have no really, because it's the thing, most of your friends are smart like you. So if you hit them on an educational tip, you're going to have that type of conversation, right? And the point is, over time, you start looking at that language change. By text, if you keep a thread of your friend and you keep it gather intel, okay, I can gather some stuff to respond. And you send to them, over time, you're going to be like, what the hell am I talking to right here? Right? Because they all of a sudden change. So with environmental racism, I'll give you one good thing to send to your friend. Neil Hughley had this documentary, great documentary called Endangered Species. I don't know if people heard about it or watched it. But there's one scene, ironically, for those of us at lunch, in Dixon County, Tennessee, where essentially they had this toxic waste dump. And it was affecting the water, just like in Flint. So see, this thing, you don't have to say anything about Flint. You send it to her and say, look at minutes 35 and 40 in this documentary. I think you'll find it interesting, right? And then I want to talk to you about it. And so in Dixon County, this toxic waste dump, they sent out a letter to residents. And the letter says, oh, yeah, your water's contaminated, but it's not a big deal. You're going to be okay, right? Listen, that's the letter black people got. The letter white people got said, you don't want to drink this water. This is present day America, right? The consequences of that were this one family, and of course, this place is segregated. You look at this county, this one little part of this county is black. They didn't get the letter, right? So what happened at that point, they keep on drinking the letter because they're like, the government wouldn't just kill us, right? I mean, of course they did before, but they aren't right? And so anyway, people in this one black family started dying of cancer. They took them to court. Won the court settlement. Family's happy. The daddy of the patriarch of the family, they were like, I think he raised the kids, and they were like, we're going to be able to give him the quality care he needs to survive and recover from this. The money never came. The county said, we didn't have any money to pay you. Yeah, of course we said, oh, we don't have the money. Your friend can't watch that and not move a little bit, right? Because not only does it touch on the statistics, it also touches on the emotional part because you start to empathize with the family. You don't have to say anything. Just send it to them. Is it a her? I heard you say she. Just send it to them. So look up endangered species. Look up, you can watch the whole documentary, but there's one clip I'm talking about is direct on environmental racism. And then talk to her about it.
We got time for one more question. There it is.
I don't want to have to use this, but I will. So thank you, and thank you for your excellent talks yesterday as well. And I want to go back to the conversation about the last question and make a comment, so I'm going to cheat, and then also ask a question. So, because I'm grad student, and that's what we do. But so my comment is the strategic performance or approximation of whiteness is it makes possible incorporation, right? Whiteness is incorporative because Italian Americans or other white ethnic groups weren't originally considered white and then were eventually incorporated, right? So in a lot of ways what your story was and some of the comments points out is that you're not just reproducing whiteness, but you're also hoping to enter into whiteness, right? And my question is, how we take seriously a platform where, this is pretty much for Dr. Ray, how we take seriously a platform where Katy Perry and Justin Bieber and Kim Kardashian are like the most successful users in terms of number of followers. How do we then take that seriously as a platform for social justice and change, right? Because that's not what they're doing. So that's my comment and my question.
Yeah, really good question. So, and you told me you're not on Twitter, right?
What?
But you on Twitter?
No.
Okay. Okay. So no, this is good. So I was like you until I got on Twitter, right? So it's one of those things where simply because people are the most popular doesn't necessarily mean that they're saying meaningful things, right? Or that they're doing meaningful things, right? So for example, popularity is one outcome, impact is another outcome, right? And oftentimes they may be highly correlated in some ways, but in other ways they're not. So like with the Ferguson data, what we found was that celebrities actually represented a very small group of people who were talking about Ferguson. So the thing about social media, similar to say being on college campuses. So we're having this conversation right now. Probably in one of these other buildings, they having some fun concert with a clown, just having a good time. And both of those things can be happening simultaneously, right? Because everyone isn't invested in what we're invested in. Interestingly though, to think about celebrities, quote unquote, in various capacities, what social media and Twitter, in a way that doesn't happen on Facebook or Instagram, allows you to do though is to connect with people who you think are influential, right? So we can directly send a message to Trump, even though he might not necessarily be handling his account, somebody's handling it for him. People like Kobe Bryant actually handles his account. On the Ferguson data said he had one of the most popular retweets. See, that's what's key about Twitter, right? He didn't form this deep message. He saw it and was like, wow, that's good. Now he sends it out to his millions of followers, coming from somebody like us sitting in this room. That's impact. What Kobe did was due to his popularity, right? So social media allows you to capitalize on that and kind of circumvent traditional ways in which we do things. It also allows us to think about how we connect in organic ways. So without social media, we wouldn't have known what happened in Missouri when they were protesting. That led to a whole bunch of stuff with other students protesting. We would have known about Eric Gardner. We would have known about Sandra Bland, right? We would have known about Mike Brown, seeing his body on there. We would have known about Walter Scott running away. So, the point, what's so dynamic about Twitter is hashtags are literally create silos. So you can have the Bieber people, they're over there doing their thing. And then you can have the Black Lives Matter people. And then you can also have, like I was saying yesterday, the TCOP people, the top conservatives on Twitter, who aren't talking to the Black Lives Matter people, but these become the normal people, right? These aren't the white supremacists. These people who live next door to you, who are saying some very racist things, right?
Go to church every
And so,
Sunday.
go to church every Sunday, wave to you, say hi, right? Invite you over to the house, right? And so these are the types of, so I get how it's hard to get. Believe me, I was the same way. Like, it took my students a long time to convince me. And let me tell you how I got convinced. I have a student, she's brilliant. Her name is Melissa Brown. She comes to me one day and she says, Rashawn, ISIS are recruiting black people in the hood, right? And I said, what? I said, that's crazy. What do you mean? She was like, on social media, on Twitter. they are using hashtags and certain words to target inner city youth who are marginalized, and they are recruiting them to then carry out their work in the United States. And I was like, that's one of the craziest things. How does that even happen? She showed me. And I was like, this matters. And then I started looking up Twitter, and I'm like, Twitter's worth $5 billion. It matters, right? And so I think it was one of those situations where we get caught up in this space, right? And we can say it doesn't matter to us, but when it matters to so many other people, we have to pay attention. I think that's the thing. So we can say like so for me, I'm like, yeah, I tweet, I do all that. But I didn't want to. I'm like, I felt like I almost needed to. Because that's where the activism for the next generation is starting. That's where it's happening. Right? And if I'm not on that, I'm not at the cutting edge of it. Last example, when the AME Church Massacre happened, I'm on Twitter collecting data for my Twitter project. Because I was looking up user profiles and all that. And something came across the profile or across just the stream, and I was like, holy crap, listen, people just got shot and killed in Charleston. So for my generation, what I do? Turn on the news. Local news, nothing. CNN, nothing. Fox News, nothing. MSNBC, nothing. So I'm like, is this legit? What? I go back to Twitter.
Blowing up.
Play by play. An hour before it broke on the news.
Yeah.
Right? Now, I know people who know people there. So I started texting them, like, is your family okay? Like, what's going on? An hour before that broke. That's what social media does. It happens before it happens, right? And that's the reason why actually in the Ferguson data set, the users who are actually, the number of users that are most represented are media people. Because they go there to find their news too. Because what better people than you want than the people who are right there in the room, right? And so, again, I get it. And I was the same way, but I've really been convinced.
Can I have just one real quick example? So when Eric Gardner, the news about the lack of indictment came out, there were people basically organizing to take over New York City. One of the most incredible uses of Twitter I've seen is that they had strategic codes for people to know, and it was all like activist insiders, right? So if you were ready to go on the streets to protest and basically interrupt traffic and all this kind of stuff, the way that we, and I was part of it, right? Like we outsmarted the police by having a moving movement, right? So historically in movements, you might pick a location, everybody stays there, meets there, then the police tell you to disperse, and then people get arrested, right? What happened here was that as soon as we heard that the police was coming, right, the code would tell us next location is such and such. So then the crowd would move. The police was too late in catching up, so then the crowd would move again. And what ended up happening was this very strategic Twitter code using to know where to go next and to basically stay ahead of the police. So that, I don't know how you would have done that, organizationally speaking, in a previous pre-Twitter era. And that's what made it, like, I finally had to go on and be like, all right, I got it.
I give up. I give up.
Hold on, last point. We track that, what she just described, right? Because you can do geocoding in Twitter, meaning you can say where your location is. We followed some activists across the Brooklyn Bridge, around other parts of New York, and followed because they would be tweeting where they were as they were tweeting. So we literally can lay out a path where we literally see them moving. I mean, like activism at its finest. Yeah. We literally followed it. And so,
kind of creepy too, though.
well, I mean, well, yeah, of course.
You can't be
Yeah, police also have
That's real. It's definitely creepy. But the thing is, like, that's a feature you turn on just from a system organization.
If you have a cell phone, they know where you
That's
are.
what I was just about to say. I was just about to say. Yeah, no, it's creepy. And to talk about surveillance, you all know that, like, in our license and on our license plates, there are also like trackers on those too, right? So believe me, they are tracking us all the time. Yeah, no, they are tracking us all the time. The only way you do it is to go off the grid, and I don't really know how you do that, right? So believe me, they're looking at Twitter. That's one of the least things they're worried about, unless it allows them to catch terrorists, right? Because as I was saying, I mean, that's real, the fact that ISIS, that they're actually recruiting people, right?
Let's give our panelists a round of I'd love to see you guys tomorrow when Professor Bonilla-Silva gives his keynote at 3:30. Be there, be square, and thanks again for your support.
This was fun. Yeah.
Rising sun, I'll be the rising sun. Until that day, I'll be your rising sun. I'll be the rising sun. Oh, until that day.